Good afternoon and welcome once again to another episode of Community Relations Corner as we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and partners all over the city. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, or the JCRC. On each episode of Community Relations Corner, we're joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership in New York, many of whom I've had the honor to get to know over the course of my lengthy tenure here at JCRC-NY. Together, we'll discuss current events impacting New York's Jewish community and its neighbors, as well as the state of our city, of our state, of our nation, and of the world. And I'm so excited to be joined today by a longtime colleague and friend, the Executive Director of Catholic Charities in New York, Msgr Kevin Sullivan. Welcome, Msgr Sullivan.
Michael, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you this afternoon. I'm just delighted to join you and your audience.
Thank you. We're so happy to have you here. The audience should be aware that this is kind of this for that. Msgr Sullivan does a radio show on the Catholic channel, satellite radio, and very frequently over various holidays, whether it's Passover or the high holidays, will invite me on to have a conversation with him. So this is payback time.
Well, I have to tell you, if every time I had to pay back, it was as delightful as this, I'd incur a lot of debts.
Thanks so much for being here. And I think that I'd like to get into two things before we deal with real substantive issues. One of them is Msgr Sullivan. We've known each other for quite a while, but I don't recall as to where you were born, where you grew up, and why you determined to enter into the priesthood.
Michael, I'm happy to kind of share that with you and with your listeners. I was born in the Bronx, and as we know, the Bronx is the only part of New York City connected to the mainland. So I was born in the Bronx. And then when I was 5, moved to just a little bit north, but actually across the border into Yonkers. And that's where I went to elementary school. One of the things that I always think was very, very influential for me is that the block that I lived on in Yonkers was very diverse. It was diverse religiously, ethnically, and I think that was probably a pretty important part of my my growing up in Yonkers. But I would say that the point that was probably the most influential for me, and as Michael, as you know, the demographic changes in New York have been significant, and there was a time in New York when a lot of people were fleeing New York. They thought it was unsafe. They didn't like some of the ethnic changes that were there. So some of the people with whom I grew up in Yonkers, and that would have been in the 50s, 60s, they liked being in Yonkers. They liked being away from New York City, even though it was right next door. Very, very important to me was I went to high school in New York City, in Manhattan, the Upper West Side. And that's where I kind of began to explore the possibility of my becoming a priest. But the thing that was critical about that was that for 4 years, I took the New York City subways from the Bronx, Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, down to the Upper West Side. And so at a time when there was a lot of turmoil in New York City, and quite frankly, there was legitimate fears about people's safety, I took that every day. So I developed a feel for New York City that I wasn't afraid of it. Maybe I should have been, but it was my city because I rode the subways. I took part in it. So that's a little bit of my background. I could go on a lot longer, but Michael, if you want to kind of focus where I go, I'd be very happy.
Yeah, well, I think where we should go is to where you are now. Well, before we get there, is I also grew up in the Bronx. I was not born in the Bronx. I was born in a hospital in Manhattan, but my father was a rabbi in Northwest Bronx. That was our neighbor. That was our hood, Kingsbridge Heights. So what was your neighborhood in the Bronx?
Well, it was the corner of Bainbridge Avenue and Gun Hill, so not too
Oh,
far away
not
from
too
there.
far away. Not too far
Right
away.
across the street from what was the first campus of Montefiore Hospital.
Oh, really? That I wasn't aware of. I grew up down the block from the Kingsbridge Armory,
Right.
just on Davidson Avenue, not that far, of course, from what most people know as Lehman College. Back then, in those days, it was Hunter Uptown and various other public schools, including DeWitt Clinton High School.
So
Um,
when I was ordained, our internship year is as a deacon. My
oh,
assignment was on University Avenue in a church just south of Fordham Road, Holy Spirit
really?
Parish. So
Oh,
I know that area of the Bronx pretty well.
okay. So we're in Yiddish we would call it Landsman. We come from the same part of the Bronx, I guess, as opposed to Europe.
Right.
So our our viewers, listeners may not be aware of the organization over which you serve as executive director, Catholic Charities. So can you give us a snapshot of how you would define maybe the elevator pitch on how you define Catholic Charities?
Sure, I would define it very simply as the Catholic UJA.
Uh-huh.
That is what, seriously, that is the closest analogy that we have. We are a human service federation of some 90 agencies. We take great pride in the fact that we have individual agencies in almost every community in the New York metropolitan area. So why, when you put us together, we provide millions of dollars of services each year, but we're really proud that we are community based and we touch almost every human need. We protect children, we help nurture youth, we support families, we respond to crises like after 9/11, Superstorm Sandy. Now with COVID, we respond. We do a lot of work making sure people are housed, whether it be building housing or preventing evictions. People are hungry. So we have community food kitchens. We have pantries. A lot of our neighbors, sadly, have some challenges. And so we have residences for those with learning delays, disabilities, mental illnesses. And given that we're in New York and given our roots, our Catholic social teaching, we do a tremendous amount of work in welcoming and integrating immigrants
Okay.
into the New York area, and some work with refugees and people seeking asylum too. So that's the broad scope of what we do, Michael.
Yeah, so thank you. And as a full-blown social service organization similar to UJA, by the way, UJA has us as the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, and the Archdiocese has the Catholic Community Relations Council, if I remember correctly. So you had referenced COVID and immigrants, homelessness. I want to dive into those. The impact of COVID-19 of this pandemic has been devastating. From a Catholic Charities perspective, what areas have you been focusing on within the framework of government restrictions, of the impact on families, on communities?
So one of the things I would say very clearly is, we've been open for business, but it's not been business as usual.
Yes.
So let me speak about three areas that have been a little bit different. I could talk about the ongoing stuff that we had to pivot, but let me speak about the three areas that we have been focused on specifically to respond to the pandemic. we know in the world that we live in so much misinformation, that there's a lot of bad information that's out there, sadly, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. So our helplines and our hotlines have remained open. In the first 6 months of the pandemic, we answered about 50% more calls than we did in ordinary times. And I'm sure there were other agencies, so I don't mean to say anything negative about other agencies, but with a little bit of pride, I do quote one of the callers who said, "Oh, I'm talking to a human voice." In so many other numbers I call, I get voicemail. I'm sure there were other agencies that were answering, but I'm proud that this caller recognized that at Catholic Charities, we like to be as present and personal as possible. So I think we answered more than 23,000 calls for information in the first 6 months. The other thing which I will mention, and again, Michael, I know how important this is to you, is we need to bring people together. And so we were just blessed that some very, very generous donors decided that people who were not eligible for federal programs, oftentimes because they didn't have the right papers, they didn't have the right documents, that they chose Catholic Charities and the UJA Federation as among a very few organizations that would distribute immediately cash assistance. So we provided millions of dollars of cash assistance to thousands of households. And to be honest, Michael, that's not what we do very often. We do a lot of counseling, we do a lot of case management, we do training of people, etc. But in this crisis, the need was cash. And we brought together some very, very generous donors. And so we provided, in a relatively short period of time, millions of dollars of cash to people who were left out. The final item I'll mention is that of food. The need for food was just catastrophic. So again, in that 6-month period, we did, I believe, what we called, and I'm sure other people did too, we did over 125 pop-up pantries. So we had our regular pantries in regular places, but there were neighborhoods and communities that needed food. And people called and said, "Can you help us?" So almost every Friday, we would bring trucks, tents, and bags of food and do 200, 500, 700 families in communities where we didn't have a regular ongoing pantry, but we popped up and we provided that assistance. And we kind of did in that first 6 months, in those pop-ups and a few of other places, over 1 million meals to New Yorkers in need. So those are 3 things that I would say: information, cash, and food. I think we did a pretty good job through dedicated staff, volunteers, and donors to at least mitigate some of the suffering that our neighbors were feeling.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that. I think our friend Vinny Levien,
Right.
I think that he's been a part of that through the Brooklyn diocese.
Yep.
And does Catholic Charities cover all of New York City?
Catholic Charities covers all of New York City, all of the United States, and all of the world.
Really?
Now, we go by different names, okay? So, and each kind of ecclesial religious jurisdiction kind of has its own. So we worked very closely with our sister Catholic Charities that covered Brooklyn and Queens, because, and that's, you mentioned Vinny,
Right.
but in every part of the United States, there is another Catholic Charities with whom we work and with whom we partner. And we're all part of, and we use the Latin phrase for charity, Caritas International, which is the National Association of Catholic charitable organizations throughout the world.
Thanks. I want to stick with COVID for
Sure.
a few more minutes and talk about its impact on families and communities, but also its impact on religious life. Since Catholic Charities, of course, is on the social service side, but it represents the Catholic Church in New York. So what impact has COVID had on the family unit, on the communities that it serves, and most importantly, on religious life?
Well, Michael, as you know, that's a very, very broad question. Let me take a part of it. And if there's another part you want me to speak to, just ask me
Okay.
to do that. I think from a spiritual point of view, it really has been a humbling experience.
Hmm.
And if we do it correctly, it can be a very, very deep, profound opportunity for spiritual growth. And let me say this to you in this way. Listen, whether we live Westchester, New Jersey, Connecticut, Long Island, we're all New Yorkers. I mean, this is all New York. And one of the things that is part of being a New Yorker is we're very proud. We're not terribly humble. We're a little bit arrogant, and we think we can control everything. Well, this comes along, and guess what? We New Yorkers are not in control. And if we do it right, we need to reflect and say, as much as we believe in human potential, as much as we believe in the actualization of our God-given dignity and respect, at the end of the day, we are not God. And at the end of the day, we need to be a little bit humble about what we can control and maybe open our lives and our hearts a little bit more to God's providence and to God's mercy when we need it. So in some ways, I think if we did it right, and I think many people did, it gave us an opportunity to say, wait a minute, we're not in charge. And if we thought we were, well, we big, proud, in control New Yorkers, we weren't. So I think that's one of the things I would say. And there's a lot more. So Michael, just ask me about what more you'd like me to speak about.
Well, I think that you've touched on it more than sufficiently. I know the impact in our own Jewish community on family life. All too many people have been impacted in their pocketbooks. They may have lost their jobs or put on furlough, and money is scarce. You talked before about cash assistance. A lot of it is also revolving around mental health. And again, I know of the leadership role that you in particular have played on the homeless crisis in New York. And a lot of that revolves around that mental health issue. And I'm hopeful that with the vaccine now beginning to be distributed, people are beginning to be inoculated, we might see some light at the end of this very dark tunnel. But while we're in this tunnel, the impact on the family unit is just devastating.
I think that's true. And it goes a number of different ways. And I do think, one of the other issues which this has raised up tremendously is, yes, we have the political divisiveness in our country, but there is a great deal of social economic divides in this country. And just yesterday, I was up at one of our smaller programs in the South Bronx. And I've been there a couple of times since this. It's right in the Mott Haven section of the Bronx. And it's right across the street from a New York City Housing Authority project. Well, those individuals and families living there, they don't have houses in the suburbs. They don't have weekend houses. They don't have big porches where they can, easily social distance. And it just brings up the incredible divide that there is, because some families, they were able to come together in a much more cohesive way because they had the ability to do this. I've heard of, intergenerational families where the kids had moved away, well, they moved back because those families had the resources to do it. Thanks be to God. When we don't get angry that some people have resources, we get angry that not enough people have enough resources to live their lives in dignity. So it could be both an opportunity for families to live in greater solidarity, not running from 27 places to another. They were all doing their Zoom meetings in the same place.
Right.
But it also provided a great deal of strain on families too.
Yeah, and most especially on minority populations, disproportionately on minority populations who feel marginalized in so many ways. We established a JCRC under Rabbi Bob Kaplan, our Intergroup Relations Division, a healthcare disparities coalition, an interfaith healthcare disparities coalition is being built. So minority populations are really being hit hardest, I think, here in New York among all the different populations and ethnic communities and religious communities that we have here.
And Michael, something that, in the middle of this, I just realized, which, I probably wouldn't have, I was a little bit dense, but which to me really struck me is so many of the people in the community where I was in Mott Haven and in other places, communities of color,
yes,
they were essential workers in this pandemic. Now, maybe clearly not all of them were working in hospitals, but when you went to the grocery store, they were the people who were checking you out. And when you took a bus, they were the bus drivers. And so these were the people who had to mingle in the height of this pandemic. They went home to their own families, hopefully social distancing, but nothing is perfect. So in so many ways, these essential workers were disproportionately impacted because in order for the rest of us to survive, they had to put their lives at risk.
yeah, 100%. And we're very, very grateful to all the frontline workers for all that they have done. Most of them without thanks, without the appreciation that they deserve, let alone the impact that the pandemic has had on their families.
Right.
Speaking about impact, right before the pandemic hit, we in the Jewish community were terribly impacted by a series of hate crimes spiking to a level that we haven't seen here in New York in many years. And it's not just anti-Semitism, it was hatred of all varieties. From your perch, how do you see that hatred and anti-Semitism manifesting today? Are there any changes that you see since the beginning of the pandemic?
Well, I think the past 4, 5, 6 years, you pick the time frame, we have become increasingly polarized.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And now it seems we can't have a conversation without shouting at each other. It seems that I can't disagree with you without getting angry at you. It seems I can't disagree with you without putting you down in some way. And Michael, this is not a partisan statement, but clearly the rhetoric that was coming out of Washington and the president didn't help to bring people together. It was divisive, and that filtered down in a lot of people in elected office who were getting very, very angry at each other in so many different ways. I think the pandemic comes along, and when you're isolated, what's the worst thing to demonize somebody you disagree with? not having contact with them. If you don't have contact with them, you just conjure up in your own mind how awful they are. Well, we were left to our own little devices to think about how other people were living. So I think the pandemic made greater, exacerbated the divisiveness that was part of our political and social rhetoric prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, well, we all hope, Monsignor, that as we wend our way through the pandemic and with so many people losing their lives on a daily basis, that when we come out of this, that we're not going to go back to where we were a year ago. Just a year ago, January, we marched across the Brooklyn Bridge, that you can see in the graphic behind me, to call an end to anti-Semitism, and a march that was called No Hate, No Fear, that we co-sponsored with UJA. And Cardinal Dolan was there, Bishop DiMarzio from the Brooklyn Queens Diocese came as well. And I'm just hopeful that maybe lessons have been learned, and hopefully some of that polarization can be healed.
I would hope that's the case. And I'll say it this way. I want to be hopeful, but genuine hope requires a commitment to action. Otherwise, it's just a Hallmark card. Genuine, from our perspective, religious hope means I have a vision of a better world, a better society. And if I have that vision, and that is what gives me hope, then I had best be working to do my part to make that vision real. So I'm hopeful, which means I need to have a commitment to making it happen.
And I'm hopeful of partnering together with you and the Cardinal, the Catholic Church, and other faith groups in New York, as we have in the past, to address the plague of hatred that we need to rid ourselves of. But speaking of hope, another part of the world is in great need of hope as well, and that's the Middle East. Can you expand on your own connection and experiences with the Middle East and the Holy Land?
Sure, and I'll do it in a couple of different ways. And Michael, I express my gratitude to you and the JCRC for sponsoring those missions to Israel, which I was privileged to be on a few years ago, which provided me with a great deal of kind of additional insight into what is going on in that area. I think it is, I mean, Israel is critically important to Christians, to the United States. It's very, very important that we understand the role that Israel had. I think it's absolutely critical. And we need to understand the tremendous challenges that are there. I mean, it is not unknown to you that there is a real fear among Christians that there may not be a Christian left in the Holy Land 25, 30 years because of the numbers. And that is a real, concern to us. Again, we all know the complexity of terrorism, of refugees, of all of those issues that are into play. And so the question of refugees and the question of the Arab, the Muslim pop, all of that is of concern to us, in trying to figure out what the just answers are in the Middle East and in the Holy Land. The one piece, Michael, if I could go on, which I can speak with a little bit of of personal experience.
Yes.
Again, about 2 or 3, maybe about 3 years ago, I did visit Christian refugees in Kurdistan, in
Really?
Erbil. After probably a year or so after ISIS had cleared everybody out of Mosul, the plains of Nineveh, and I visited the refugee camps that were there. Catholic Near East Welfare Association is doing a lot of work in that area, and they sponsored a mission. And it was a very, very moving trip. I think it was almost overnight that 60,000 Christians were driven from Karakosh, the plains of Nineveh, out of there by ISIS to Erbil, where they just sought refuge. And so it is just such a difficult situation, which we need to pray about every single day.
Yeah, well, I think you've touched on a very sensitive subject, and that is the plight of Christian communities in the Middle East. We also often hear of the persecution of Christian groups. It's not clear to us as to why here in the United States Christians typically don't necessarily speak up for their brothers and sisters in the Middle East. So we in the Jewish faith do it regularly. Can you explain what the relationship is or isn't between Christians in America and Christians in the Middle East?
I think it's Michael, you're not the first person to have raised this. And to be honest, it was one of the reasons I was very, very pleased to be invited to go there. And when I came back, I spoke about the persecutions of Christians there. But I think you are right. It's not something that American Christians or Christians in the United States speak about a lot. Why is that?
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, there is a little bit of, and I'm not saying it's right, but there's a little bit of reticence among some Christians, like, well, maybe we shouldn't be speaking up for ourselves. Like, we'll speak up if others are being persecuted, but it's a little self-serving to speak up about ourselves. And I think that's real. I'm not saying it's the way it should be, but if you want an explanation as to why, I think there's a little bit of that is ingrained in Christians, and I would say in Catholics. Well, I shouldn't be promoting myself. I shouldn't be speaking up. Not saying it's that, but I think that's real. The other issue is, and this has to do with being in the United States. And the reality is, the United States got these two big oceans on either side, and we tend not to be very internationally flavored in our perspective. We look at what's happening close to home. So I think, that doesn't excuse it, but I think it may give your listeners a little bit of a sense of why it is the case. And I would say, Michael, I think one of the advantages that the Jewish community brings, there is such a strong tie with Israel and Jews in the United States that it's almost impossible not to be aware of those things. Not the same. And I said this a couple of years ago when I was invited by the UJA Federation to join some of your leadership on a trip to Rome. Mm-hmm. And we visited the Jewish ghetto in Rome, mm-hmm. et cetera. And in one of the conversations, I said something that I think shocked some of the Jewish community. I said, Rome and the Vatican are basically irrelevant to our Christian faith. We're not tied to a land. We're not tied to a nation. We're not tied to a particular place, which is very different, as I read in scripture readings earlier this week in our situation, which was about King David. How clearly in the book of Samuel, there is a clear clear anointing of David, anointing of his house, and a promise of his legacy. And periodically I preach in the community. I said, you know, if you want to understand a little bit about the strong place that Israel has to the Jewish community, just listen to what the book of Samuel says, and you'll have a much better understanding of how the Jewish community feels about Israel.
Maybe we should invite you, Monsignor, to speak at a number of synagogues in New York as well about that. It's interesting on your first point about some Christian Americans not having the desire to speak up because it's self-serving. Hillel, in the great sage Hillel, in our Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, says, "Emein ani li mili," if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So you have to be for yourself, you have to be for others, and you have to take action. So that's our orientation to it. That's our approach. And it's just a bit befuddling sometimes dealing. I give you one example, dealing with the Maronite Christians in Lebanon. I just don't hear that clarion call that we in the Jewish community would expect of ourselves. But I'm not going to belabor the point. You've addressed it.
But Michael, I think you're right. I think it's true. And I also think, and I'm not an expert on this, but in some of, you pointed out the Maronite Christians and obviously I'm a Roman Catholic, and most, Catholics in the United States are Roman Catholics, but there's oftentimes in some of those other parts of the world, there is a very complicated, but a very entwined relationship with some of the political establishment in those places, and particularly in some of those countries. And there's a real attempting to figure out how one negotiates all of that. And I think that's some of what you may be experiencing.
Yeah, thanks. But we've kind of opened up a door regarding Catholics and how they observe as to others. Let's talk for a few minutes about Christmas season, which is now upon us. And I can't thank you enough. None of us at JCRC can thank you enough for taking time in this week before the holiest day on the Christian calendar to spend a few minutes having a conversation. So again, our sincere gratitude. But how do Catholics observe Christmas as opposed to other Christian denominations?
Well, there are some Christian denominations, and again, I'm not an expert on this, who really downplay kind of the celebration of Christmas. Obviously, I believe in Jesus Christ, and the mainstream Christian religions do. But for Catholics, we have two great feasts. I mean, there's the Feast of Christmas, and then there's the Feast of, and I'll put it together, Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Those two are our two premier feasts. The way I would say it from a spiritual point of view,
yes,
is that Christmas is a feast of great joy, a great festival. And I might say, if I might borrow, it is really a festival of light. It is a festival of, we believe that the light came into the darkness and the darkness could not extinguish it. And so it is a festive, joyous feast. We get to Easter and Good Friday, we deal with some very, very profound spiritual realities, not unlike Yom Kippur and some of those aspects, which damper the total joy of those seasons because we know the way it came to be. So for us is just an incredible joy. And here's the joy for us. The joy is that we believe in only the way that religious mystery could say something, is we believe that our divine Savior, Jesus, became truly human. And so that what we celebrate is that our Savior Jesus became one with us, and therefore teaches us of the great possibilities of our humanity. Because if our humanity could hold the divine, then imagine how great that humanity is. And therefore, the imperative that's part of it is that if we celebrate Christmas, we need to maximize our human potential. We have been shown the greatness of our humanity, and therefore we can't not seek to maximize that in love, in peace, in hope that we bring to the world, that we are called to be the light of God to the world.
How interesting that is. Thank you for that. How interesting that is that we just ended the festival of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is very much a festival of light as well, and how these two feasts or festivals are linked at times because our holidays are on the lunar calendar and the Christian holidays are on the solar calendar. That Hanukkah can actually what we would call be late and come towards the end of December as opposed to at the end of November and the beginning of December, or this year mid-December. But they're both festivals of light. God works in mysterious ways to bring two distinct religions together around a similar theme.
Well, it is. And, like I said, I'm not a theologian, but we embrace the Hebrew scriptures.
Right.
That is part of our tradition. And again, Michael, you're aware of this, but your listeners, this may be a little bit of information. In the early centuries of Christianity, there were some Christians who said, we want to get rid of what we would call the Old Testament. And it was clearly defined by the broader Christian community. No, that is our tradition. The Hebrew scriptures are important to us. They are part of our canonical scriptures.
Right, they are. I know that having visited with many of my clergy friends in the Christian world, looking at the Bible that they carry, it's actually what they refer to as the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Right.
And we refer to it as the Tanakh, as the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim and the scriptures. But let me go back to Middle East matters as well, in that we talked about Rome, but we didn't talk about Bethlehem. Traditionally at the Church of the Nativity is a marking, like a midnight mass, I assume, there. Do you have any knowledge as to what's going to be happening this year because of the pandemic?
I do, because Mike, as you alluded to, I do have a weekly radio show. And on my show last week was the chancellor, the president of Bethlehem University.
Really?
And I spoke with him about that. And there will not be the usual crowds in Manger Square in Bethlehem. There probably will be a very small mass. Most people will be in their own places. So it will not be um, the traditional Christmas in Bethlehem, and so it is kind of very, very sad that it'll be so different this year.
Yeah, it's always something which is marked globally through the media.
Yeah,
It's particularly since we're 7 hours
yeah,
behind. 12 midnight there is only 5 p.m. here. So it's always going to end up on the evening news. And today news is a 24-hour cycle with social
yeah.
media, et cetera, let alone 24-hour news stations. But
And
I wanted to
Michael, let me
evaluate.
just
Yeah,
say one thing,
sure.
because I think it's important that bringing people together, trying to deal with some of the divisions, we have to recognize that they exist so that we can work on them. And that midnight mass in Bethlehem always, I think, in a number of years, was one of those events that realized that we still had a lot of work to do,
Yeah.
because the question was, could people get through checkpoints? How many people were going to be let in? And we all understand the absolute need for security because of the potential of terrorism. And yet we also understand the need for people to be able to worship. So almost in a sense, as you said, because of the media attention there, it highlighted that we weren't where, or we aren't where we need to be in that kind of religious understanding and that religious unity.
Yeah, and speaking of religious understanding, and you use the phrase bringing people together, well, let's talk for a few minutes about the what is referred to as the Judeo-Christian tradition. Um, can you offer your views on the influence of Judeo-Christian tradition on American culture, on society as a whole? I mean, do you view Judeo-Christian tradition as a reality, or is it fiction?
Oh, it's an absolute reality, without a doubt. I mean, that is kind of so much the history of the West, of whether it be the history of Europe, the history of this country. It's undeniable the value that the Judeo-Christian tradition has brought. Period. At the same time,
Yeah.
we are sinful, and we are we are a sinful people, and therefore there is a lot of blemish in that tradition. There is a lot of things that that took centuries to overcome. There are things still part of that tradition that we need to work out. But I have to tell you that I'll just share with you my own opinion.
Yeah.
We cannot obliterate the past. We need to understand it. We need to recognize what's good. We need to recognize what's wrong, and then move forward from that. So I don't think that's just kind of my feeling, which I think is just a lot of common sense about recognizing where we are in the world.
And that's very important for us to contemplate. Kind of an outgrowth of that is that there's a new administration coming into the White House in Washington, and Joe Biden identifies as Catholic. Do you have any knowledge as to whom he turns, if he does, to anyone within the Catholic Church to influence him, or not necessarily to influence him, but to have an impact on his decision making? I mean, is there a spiritual side to this? It's only the second Catholic, I believe, ever to be president of the United States. The first was John Kennedy.
Yeah.
Is that something also that the Catholic community takes pride in?
So I have I've shaken Joe Biden's hand once. I've never had a conversation with him. So what I know is kind of from what I observe and maybe from what a few other people have said to me. From every stretch of the imagination or from whatever we know, Joe Biden is a very, very traditional practicing Catholic. He is not, he is not extreme. He is like tens of millions of other Catholics in this country. So, and I would say my observation is relatively devout. I mean, he goes to mass every Sunday, and in this day and age, not everybody's going to mass every Sunday. He seems to be a very believing, practicing Catholic, and that motivates, that drives him. Now, let me just say this one thing, because it is problematic for many, many Catholics, the fact that one of our preeminent issues, the sanctity of life, the dignity of life from the first moment of conception, he has espoused a position which is not in accord with that preeminent Catholic value. So that's something that causes a significant issue among many Catholics. Having said that, I don't think there is any doubt that he is a practicing Catholic, and he is one with his faith means something. It motivates him in the way that he views a variety of things. So in that sense, I think, having said, I mentioned the one issue of abortion, which causes people, many Catholics, problems, but in many of the other Catholic social values, which stress the common good, preferential option for the poor, concern for the stranger, I think there is a lot to be very, very hopeful in him bringing the best of those Catholic values into the Oval Office and into the policies that hopefully our country will espouse going forward.
Oh, that's very insightful and greatly appreciated. I have two additional questions for you. One is, I've been told that there is a term called the Pope's Jews. Can you define that for us?
Well, I will tell you, because it was told to me on the trip when I was in Rome with the UJA Federation. So this is passing on information that I learned from the Jewish community. So here's what I know, okay? That I'm told that the earliest Jewish diaspora community was in Rome. I think maybe 150 years before the Common Era, sometime, but it was there for a long time. And in the Roman ghetto, the Pope took a particular interest in that Jewish community. And again, looking at the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a lot for us Christians to be ashamed about in the way that we treated Jews. But the Pope took a special interest in that community. And while by no stretch were they equal, but they were prevented, I'm told, from some of the worst abuses of discrimination because they had the Pope as their protector. And I'm told, which I think is a nice story, is he didn't say they had to convert, but they had to listen to at least one or two sermons a week on Christianity. And if they listened to one or two sermons a week, they got the benefit of kind of the papal protection as being the Pope's Jews. Now, Michael, that was told to me. I haven't done any independent research, but as I say, it's got a sense of verisimilitude to it, given the way that we negotiate the little bit of the messy world that we live in.
Thanks for that answer. I think we have to do a little bit more research on that.
Right.
And we're going to end on a light note. Just this past week, we had a great Jewish food debate here at JCRC on a Zoom, and we had judges. We had 4 judges, 3 of whom were Protestant Christian pastors. 2 couples and an individual, and one was an imam whom you know. And we shared with them a number of kosher snacks, mostly from Israel, and wanted to judge, just have a good time and to judge the taste and the texture, etc. So as we're entering into Christmas season, and you talked about feasts, and we just ended Hanukkah, we certainly feasted. Are there any Jewish foods that you're a New Yorker, you're from the Bronx like me, you're
Right.
from Yonkers, you and I talk like we're from New York. Are there any Jewish foods that you particularly like?
I couldn't live without bagels. Couldn't live without bagels.
Well, the good thing about bagels, to be a bit more mystical about it, is that they're round, and the roundness in our foods, I think, relates to our cycle of life, our cycle of holidays, our cycle of traditions. And so we've gone full circle in this conversation with Msgr Kevin Sullivan, the Executive Director of Catholic Charities. And I just like to give you, Monsignor, we're so thankful that you're able to join us for this Community Relations Corner episode. And do you have like a last word that you want to share with our audience, which is no doubt made up of members of the Jewish faith and in other faiths as well, hopefully some Catholics too?
Well, I guess, Michael, at this time of the year, with the celebration of Hanukkah, with the celebration of Christmas, I guess my final word would be just may we all be beacons of light to deal with the darkness of pandemic, the darkness of injustice, the darkness of economic devastation, and whatever individual darknesses there are in our own families. And may this festival of lights, be it Hanukkah, be it Christmas, may it be a blessing so that we might be lights to our world in the upcoming year.
Amen. Amen to that, my dear friend, Msgr Kevin Sullivan. Thank you so much for joining us. You're joining us in and of itself is a blessing, and it's a blessing as well to our wonderful and dedicated audience, those who are joining us live and those who will be seeing this on various platforms and social media. I'm Michael Miller, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Community Relations Corner. Happy holidays to all. Shalom, and be well. Bye-bye.